Welcome to International Biorenewables Law and Policy. This presentation is part one of a three-part series on algae and aviation biofuels. In this presentation, we'll talk about the importance of algae in the biofuel landscape and why it's such an interesting feedstock to study. Algae is a term that represents a large number of photosynthetic organisms. We've maybe have seen pictures of algal blooms in different kinds of scenarios, but biologically speaking, there are a large number of organisms that fall under the category of algae. Because this is not a biology class, we're not going to cover in detail the differences between the different species, but what we will talk about is how some of those differences play a role in determining the types of biofuels that we can produce from the different kinds of algae. The reason algae is of such great interest to scientists and national policy is that among the different types of biomass, algae has demonstrated to have possibly the highest biomass production potential. If you look at it from the perspective of how much oil, this is hydrocarbons, that you could get from an acre of growing different types of biomass, you will find that algae is far and away the highest producing type of biomass that we've identified. At the very bottom here, you have corn, which is usually grown to produce corn ethanol. You can get about 18 gallons of oil equivalent from an acre of corn. And as you move up, you have known crops such as jatropha and palm oil. Palm oil, you get as much as 635 gallons of oil per acre that you grow it on. Algae, on the low end, this is what you would typically expect from production level facilities, can be as much as 1,200 gallons per acre. In laboratories, in very controlled scenarios, scientists have been able to get yields as much as 10,000 gallons per acre, or would be equivalent to that if you were to grow it at that productivity level at commercial scale. And so this is one of the reasons why algae is very promising, and we'll talk about some implications in terms of land use. In terms of land use, what that productivity translates into is if you look at the total gasoline consumption in the United States, it usually hovers around 100 billion gallons per year, between 100 and 130 billion gallons per year. Well, if we wanted to produce 100 billion gallons of oil, we can certainly look at the red bars or red squares shown in this graph. Depending on which part of the United States you grow the algae, you get different factors in terms of sunlight exposure, nutrient availability, different factors that affect algal growth that we'll talk about in more detail. But when you combine all those factors and you estimate how much land you need, you can see that in the Southwest, for example, California region, you would only need about 15.4 million acres to grow 100 billion gallons of algae. Essentially, in a small patch somewhere in Arizona, we could produce all the biofuel to run all the United States transportation fleet. That's every single consumer in the United States could be fueled by algae grown in a small patch in Arizona. That's if we were able to produce algae at a very high productivity level, and that's part of the promise of this type of bio. As already mentioned, algae comes in different forms. And depending on the type of species that you select and the biology of that species, you may choose to cultivate it in different ways. And so in the second group here, you can have open systems and closed systems. You can have offshore systems. Offshore systems are attractive because they're natural systems that are essentially don't need a lot of management, and so you could just go and harvest the algae that's growing naturally. Both open and closed systems require some form of management, Typically, open systems are cheaper, but you get lower productivity, and closed systems are more expensive but more productive because of the controlled environment. Regardless of the method that you employ to grow the algae, you can then convert its different constituents into different types of products. Typically, algae are known for being heavy in lipid content, that's oil, but you can also have algae with fairly high carbohydrate content, and some will have proteins as well. These different constituents can be converted using some of the conversion methods that we've talked about previously into the types of fuels that you would expect in the transportation mix. Biodiesel, we'll see, is a very straightforward product to make from algae, but you could also make renewable hydrocarbons. This is gasoline and diesel. You can produce alcohol, such as ethanol. You can digest it into producing biogas for methane and natural gas markets. And there are also co-products. Obviously, algae has some pharmaceutical products that can be made from it, some nutrition additives that can be made from algae as well. And all these play a role in marketing the use of algae. If you look at converting whole algae, this is without splitting it into its constituents, we can use many of the thermochemical processes that we have discussed in our first week in this module. Anaerobic digestion, as I mentioned, will produce biogas. Hydrothermal processing will help you produce transportation fuels. You have pyrolysis and gasification that can produce gasoline and diesel, but also alcohols, hydrogen, and other types of fuels. If you separate algae into its components, the lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins, you can try to use different tactics for each of the different components. The carbohydrates and proteins can be fermented to produce alcohols, such as ethanol, and the oil is a lot easier to upgrade into diesel, biodiesel, and even gasoline, kerosene, and other types of hydrocarbon products. The advantages of separating them this way is that you can get a higher selectivity towards desirable products, and so you improve the efficiency of the conversion process. To give you an idea of what the overall process looks like from a facility perspective, there are several steps involved in the conversion of algae into biofuels. This diagram here is from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and what they're showing here is on the left side, you have your production facility. You have algae that is being grown. In order to grow algae, you need a large amount of water. You need inoculum, that just includes some of the nutrients that the algae needs to grow. You need carbon dioxide, which would come from a power plant, for example. And once the algae grows, you can harvest it by allowing it to settle. You can use some membranes and centrifuges to separate the biomass from the media or the water media in which it grew. That media you want to recycle back so that you can reuse many of the nutrients that are in that media. The algae itself you can then send into a fermentation or conversion process here. In this case, they use a dilute acid hydrolysis to break down the walls of the cell. The carbohydrates that come out of that can be sent to a sugar fermentation process. By fermenting the sugars, we produce ethanol, just like we do with corn. The solid byproduct from that process is called stillage, and that stillage contains the oils coming from the algae. The oils can be upgraded using a little bit of hydrogen into gasoline and diesel. That's naphtha is another word for gasoline. And any remaining biomass can be digested using anaerobic digestion to produce methane for combined heat and power. Finally, the last part of the algae to be left over is called a digestate. The digestate can be fed to animals as animal feed if you mix it appropriately with other types of animal feeds to maintain a healthy ratio of nutrients for the animals. But converting algae into biofuels is not just a matter of the facility. there are many other factors that play a role into determining the efficiency of the process. These include climate, include availability of CO2, it includes land geological considerations, it includes water availability. And so all these different things have to be taken into account. And let's not forget, you have to have a market not just for the fuels, but for other co-products. And so a lot of the challenges with marketing algae are not necessarily just in the feedstock or the conversion, but in understanding how all these different items play a role with each other. A more detailed look on the assumptions that you have to make. This diagram shows some of the different questions that one would have to ask when trying to establish an algae to fuel facility. Certainly, it starts with siting. Where do you want to locate it? What will be the cost of building it there? Is there enough solar insulation? What are the typical temperatures? What's the climate and weather like? What kind of algae are you going to select for that particular location? That includes species, what requirements they have, what kind of performance would you get, what kind of resources are available, do you have enough CO2, enough water and nutrients. All these decisions are part of the design criteria that go into determining what kind of cultivation system you're going to use. And the cultivation system will provide some biological feedback because it does alter the performance of the algae. And then you can go back into the conversion steps that we've just discussed. Obviously, many of these different parts of the process are influenced by what types of policy and regulations are available, what incentives and barriers play a role in determining which products are most valuable to consumers or to the government, what kind of external revenues could you get, are there some limits in the types of water that you can use, or the levels of water treatment that you would need in that at the facility. So it's a very complex discussion that needs to take place when siting a facility, and that's part of the challenge, not just of algae, of other types of biomass, biofuels as well, but algae in particular, because of the way it needs to be cultivated and harvested, suffers from careful requirements regarding all these different variables shown in this graph. To sort of summarize and put this into perspective, if you have algal biomass growing in a region, you can take that biomass, extract your lipids for fuel. That fuel includes energy, both in the form of liquids or power and heat. You have some nutrients that can be recovered in the form of ash, soil amendments, or soil fertilizer and conditioners. But then you have the major products. So the proteins, we already mentioned, those are valuable food or feed supplements. If you want to go to a higher value markets for non-fuel lipids, you can try to produce surfactants and bioplastics, soaps, certainly green alternatives to the fossil-based products out in the market. And the carbohydrates are best suited to produce alcohols such as ethanol, butanol, and other types of chemicals. So to summarize this first part, we've talked about why algae is a promising feedstock for biofuel production. Certainly its high productivity is among the greatest and by far greater than many of the different types of biomass that we have. We know that it can be converted into a variety of biofuels and products. We still need to answer the question of whether we can do this economically. And whether we are able to do this will depend on being able to make the right supply chain decisions regarding where we locate the facility, how do we use water, energy, and other resources around the facility.